I was, so my background, my PhD was in philosophy, looking at the relationship between time and community. So I guess I'm really interested in how concepts of time and concepts of community might be interrelated, and also how social understandings of time are used in social methods of inclusion and exclusion. So that's kind of where I'm coming from when I'm thinking about these kinds of things. But I guess I was partly asked to talk about, how can you think about duration and seriality in philosophy? And of course, there's so many different approaches. There's no way that I could be just to all the different amounts of approaches there would be in philosophy to these kinds of questions. There's a few people in particular that I won't be talking about that I think most of you, or some of you probably will be familiar with. So, things like Bastian's work, Deleuze and Liz Gross. There's also McTaggart's, if anybody's come across McTaggart's A series and B series times, probably also another interesting one to look at. But what I really wanted to talk today, what I sort of wanted to share was some of the philosophical approaches that I found particularly useful for my work. So it's just sort of an idiosyncratic selection of the things that I found really helpful in my work. And I think each of them have got something really interesting to say about how we think about how moments of time are connected and how things persist across time, or how we understand persistence. So partly, I guess, So the first I wanted to talk about was Newton, of course. So I thought I'd start with Newton and talk about his understanding of temporal succession. And also, I'm sorry to anybody who knows all these all quite well. I think some people might know some and some people might know others, so hopefully there'll be something you haven't heard before if you know these people quite well. But I think Newton's really interesting. Just because I think he's really the bad guy. He's quite easy to paint as the bad guy. And his idea of temporal succession, I think, is really still quite influential. So I think it's probably important to sort of revisit how he described the process and the change over time. So I think I'm going to be pretty much painting the bad guy picture here, but I think probably if you did look at his work, there'd be more complexities and ambiguities that probably were worth exploring. But so in the Principia, Newton developed his own mathematical account of time that contrasted with common sense notions of time. So he argued that time, at the time, people were more often saying that time was a property of an object, or that time was a property of relations between objects. But he was quite very interested in taking time away from being a property of things and treating it as an entity in its own right. So he characterized this absolute time, firstly by claiming that it had an essential uniformity. So so this is a quote from him, so while all motions may be accelerated and retarded, the flowing of absolute time is not liable to any change. That is, absolute time must be understood as something that flows equably without relation to anything external. So there's that first sense, I guess, of time, that it's moving but always at the same pace. So this absolute time is also all-encompassing. For example, Newton argued that all things are placed in time as to order of succession. So this means that all entities or events can be placed in a single timeline that locates each event as simultaneous before or after every other event. So one implication of this, which has been really important for me, is that for Newton, all events should be understood as coexistent with everything else that occurs at the same time. So I found this really interesting. I guess you could sort of see it in Neve's discussion this morning about the way that, and also in Andrew's talk about the way that there's going to be multiple experiences of time, multiple trajectories occurring at the same time. But I think what can happen quite often, or what can be quite dangerous, is that Newton's account of physical time gets translated over into the social and gets used as an understanding of social time. Without sort of understanding the ambiguities. But particularly a problem even though his idea of physical time is, we know that time doesn't actually work the way that Newton says it does, so that even physical time doesn't have this sort of universal simultaneity about it. Even in the physical world it doesn't work that way, but there'll be times, I guess, when we still assume a simultaneity across all humans that can sort of feed into different ways of including and excluding different groups of people. So as well as saying that time is all-encompassing, he also argues that the order of temporal succession is fixed. So the order of the parts of time is immutable. So basically, this sort of picks up on the McTaggart's idea of time, where each event will be before or after particular other events. And even though you're traveling a long time, you might be traveling along this line of time, supposedly, the event in and of itself will always be before something and after something else. So that relationship is always the same, no matter what point of time we're looking at. So putting this all together, Newton proposes that time moves from the past towards the future in a single all-encompassing flow made up of non-repeatable moments. So for Aristotle, I thought we could go to Aristotle next. So Newton provides a very neat picture of succession, or seriality, and so I wanted to go backwards to an earlier philosopher to complicate the question of succession. So picking up on Aristotle in the physics, the kinds of things he's talking about there, picks up this sort of ancient Greek question about the nature of time, and particularly the problems created by metaphysics of presence. So assuming that existence equals presence. So only things that exist now. The only way to exist is to be now. And if you're not in a now, you can't exist. Or a thing can't exist. So Aristotle discusses this in his treatment of time in physics. The problem here is the ambiguous role of the now. At stake in the question is the question of how the now point, as the locus of presence and self-identity, can participate in the flow of time. So if you have this idea of this is now, and this is the sort of identical closed moment, how can you understand that now as moving into a past or into a future? So what happens sort of at the tail ends of either sides of that? Is there sort of this half present, half now thing that's sort of not existing or half existing? It sort of creates all these kinds of problems. So as Martin Hagelin points out, as long as you hold to the idea of an indivisible now, or more succinctly, as long as one holds onto the concept of identity as present in itself, it is impossible to think succession. So when you have that definition of now, you can't, how do you think about time as flowing? So trying to keep this sense of the now as indivisible and identical to itself, Aristotle actually initially argues that the now is not a part of time. Since if time is to be understood as continuous, then it cannot be made up of a succession of points. So just as a line is not made up of points, since spatial points must always be discrete from each other, time can't be made up of nows, which are also discrete. But on the other hand, the now also is clearly a part of time. And it's quite interesting here when he starts thinking about the now as in time, that the now actually starts performing this double role. So he then suggests that the now is both what links time together, since what connects the past and the future. So you have the now, if you've got a line of time, the now bridges this gap between past and future, and so it connects. But the now is also what bounds or limits time, since it marks the beginning of the future and the end of the past. So you also have this idea of the now as being a cut between what was before and what was afterwards. So when the now connects time can be understood as continuous succession. But since the past is also clearly not the future, so you've got this idea of continuous succession, but then you also want to say, well, that bit's not like that bit. Past and future aren't the same as each other. So then time has to be divided, and so you can't have pure succession. So, this is all quite complicated, and sort of given all these ambiguities, Aristotle suggests that a close analysis of time would make one suspect that it either does not exist at all, or barely, and in the most obscure way. I kind of like how he says that, because he's also just, this doesn't make any sense. But what I think is really interesting, he's writing it himself, but he sort of is, But I guess what's really interesting about this idea of so time, in the sort of Western historical traditional conception of time, time is both continuous and divided. And I think this is quite interesting when we link it to sort of different kinds of political debates. So one way I've used that understanding of seriality, I guess, is to think about this problem of political apologies. So, there's been a discussion with Cameron at the moment, but there's lots of political apologies where people will either say, the past doesn't exist, or the past is over and done with. time has moved on, it's, there's vision of time, and so therefore I don't need to apologize. Whereas when you look at the people who do make an apology, they talk about time as continuous. So they'll say, no, we are responsible for the past, but the effects of the past are still felt in the present. And they tell a story of this continuous time. So it's quite interesting in those political debates that you actually have these different temporal logics of time as being continuous or time as discontinuous. And so there's sort of discussion about, well, which one do we sort of pick up on, which one's more liberatory, which one's more sort of beneficial. And I think what's really interesting about Aristotle's account is that what it shows is that this debate over continuous time or discontinuous time are not really debates over two different kinds of time or different kinds of temporal logics, but they actually point to the ambiguity arising in the framework of linear time itself. So this is kind of counterintuitive, but what this ambiguity suggests is that continuity is not strictly the contradiction of discontinuity. Instead, connection and disconnection are interdependent ambiguities inherent in linear time itself. So it's sort of this, because time can either be continuous or discontinuous because of the way it's been conceptualized in Western philosophy, there's sort of always this choice or this political decision that sort of has to be made about how you're going to tell your story, because it's not clearly one or the other, it's ambiguous. So it's quite interesting that you've got this quite, it's very sort of seemingly, it's this very metaphysical, abstract account of time, but it just shows that how political time is, these decisions that we make about it. So then, Heidegger. So of course, so one of the assumptions that Aristotle makes is that he makes this assumption about now as this locus of presence, and he makes the assumption about this basic linear flow of time. And so I thought it would be interesting to move to Heidegger, partly because he suggests a different way of thinking about duration. So rather than this now point of duration, he thinks about that quite differently. And he also thinks about how time is sequenced quite differently. So first, to think about his idea of, I guess what you might mean by the now. So I think this kind of picks up what Stuart was sort of questioning about what is the now and how long is the now. So he talks about in everyday life that you experience moments qualitatively, not punctually, not as points. And so there's three main characteristics for this experience, this qualitative experience. And so you have spannedness, datability, and significance. So, can you tell me how much time?
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Okay. So spannedness, I guess, just quickly, I guess he's talking this idea that you never just have this punctual now, you have this idea of now while. So you have now while the concert is going on, or now while the sun is in the sky, or now while this egg cooks. So the spannedness, your now will be different in different occasions, and it will be it will sort of extend across time. It won't be just this point. Datability is sort of that every moment of time is linked with a particular object or event. So every moment is also related to a when, I guess. So for example, now when I'm sitting at this computer. So you don't have this abstract now. It's always now when I'm doing this, or now when, at the time when I had my breakfast, or then when my friends come home. So it's not this free-floating moment. It's always, the present is always an end presenting or something, so there's always content. And significance, that moments mean things as well, so you can talk about the right time to do things or the wrong time to do things. So again, trying to think of them not as being abstract. And then I also sort of wanted to talk about this seriality, but I'm not sure I have too much time for that really. But I think, I assume we'll sort of be familiar with this idea that he's sort of challenging this idea that you have past, present, future spread out separated from each other. And instead he's trying to think of them as being all quite entangled with each other. So one of the things I quite like is this idea of how you get to have an experience of the future. And so probably we know about this, that it's our being towards death is how we have a sense of the future. So he sort of imagines this situation where you think forward towards your death, and you think further to this time when you're past and you don't exist anymore, and you're just a memory to everybody else. And then you come back from that to the present, and that is what gives you a sense of future. So in Heidegger, the future is actually sort of going out and back again like this, rather than just a straight trajectory forward like this. And even in the past, when you come back, you don't come back to a pure present self. You come back to a self that's already got memories, that's already got ideas of what's possible. And also that this past that we bring with us, this having been, shapes what we think is possible for that future. So our past goes into the future as well and will shape what we think we can do there in that future. And I think one of the things I think is really interesting about this, for thinking about challenging this idea of seriality, I guess, is that when you're thinking about making a different future or better, or different kind of future from what you had before, part of the work that's involved is challenging this having been that you've brought with you that shapes the possibilities that you understand for the future. So part of imagining a different future is having broader, different kinds of paths to draw on to give you an idea of what you might want to do in the future. So those are sort of, they're all from the canon, and so it seems, some people will know these quite well already, but I wanted to suggest two examples quickly of work that I thought challenges the idea of seriality and duration in different kinds of ways. So this comes from Gloria Anzaldúa. She's a Mexican-American poet and activist. And her work is often thought about to challenge ideas of linear, quite flat space, I guess. So she's often thought about, or homogeneous space. But I found her work quite interesting for how she thinks about time, and particularly how she challenges this idea of a Newtonian or encompassing time. So I think this is part of a poem that she's got in one of her books, and I just find it really interesting for the sort of confusing amalgam of past, presents, and futures that she writes about. And particularly what I think is really important here is that she doesn't act as if a succession in time obliterates everything that went past it, but rather that you can have different trajectories still continuing in the present that can be very contradictory to each other. And these ideas of justice sort of get challenged in this kind of way. How do you do justice in this context where there's, she's talking about the US, the sort of southwestern US, where the land has been taken over by different people at different stages. And that, how do you deal with justice in this kind of contradictory multiple past that comes into the present in different kinds of ways and projects different kinds of futures. And then so lastly, I just wanted to bring one final example in, because I think this is really important for thinking about what direction are we assuming when we talk about seriality as well. So I'll just read this one out. So it's from an anthropologist, Debbie Bird-Rose's book, and Hobble's Daniari is one of her interlocutors in her work. And he was sort of talking about how we here now, meaning we here in this shared present, are differentiated from early days people by the fact that they preceded us and made the conditions of our existence possible. In relation to them, we're the behind mob, those who come after. The future of the domain is the domain of those who come after us. They are sometimes referred to as the new mob, or those behind we. So I thought it was really interesting when I first read this that it was, it felt kind of queasy. I felt kind of queasy, actually, quite very turned around to think that the future is back that way and the past is that way in relation to me. So kids are back that way and grandparents are that way, and I'm travelling into the past rather than travelling into the future. And I think, it's just really interesting because I think it challenges so many of our assumptions about what is justice, what is responsibility, how do we think about forgiveness if the past is in front of us rather than behind us? How do we think about agency or salvation when you have the direction of seriality is in a different way? Anyway, so I think it's probably just thanks.
That's great. Thank you. So I think we kind of started with taking questions after each paper. I'll continue with that. So anybody got any questions or Michelle, reflections on what it would mean for your own work to think about the past being ahead rather than behind, still mulling that one over. Okay, we've got Chris and then Daniel and then Rachel.
Thank you, Michelle. Obviously, I really enjoy the different notions of sort of making time, different strategies for making time. I wonder what you thought about Heidegger's reliance on the notion of being and identity as underlying sort of.
No, well, in my thesis, I ended up talking a lot about Heidegger and then said, no, Derrida's much better. And so I ended up using a lot more of Derrida's work because I didn't. it is very interesting in Heidegger's work how he entangles past, present, and future together, but he ends up sort of creating this idea that there is sort of whole, authentic unity, and I find that really troubling because I guess from my questions before, I think it's important to think about the place of alterity and breaks between things and out of joint and things like that. So I guess that movement in Heidegger is really problematic. But I still think this idea of that idea of the having been and the need politically to deal with your having been and to make your having been more open I think that's partly why I'm interested in Derrida's work, because I think what deconstruction does really quite well in an interesting way is making the having been of a culture or a tradition more open and open to different kinds of interpretations because it's not so settled, I guess. So no, I think it's interesting, but not the sort of be-all and end-all.
Yeah, I just said something that puzzled me for quite some time, and it goes back to Andrew's talk as well. Kind of, when we talk about, or when you guys talk about space and time, it's always like the past, the present, and the future. But then in terms of space, it's only the present or the absent. And I think there might be something missing there to think about, because I don't know, I like there to be a third thing, the present and absent on something else to think about.
Well,
how do things come into being? I mean, they don't just turn up, because it's a kind of continuity in time that things develop, but then it's only the present or the absent. So what's happening in between there? I find that, to talk about, at least in this kind of context, that would be quite worthwhile, I think.
Yeah, well, I guess that's part of the whole metaphysics of presence, is that you either exist or you don't exist. Are you now or are you not now? And then that's that sort of problem of how does the now enter into the flow of time? If you're thinking of existence as only presence, how do you have this sort of half presence that sort of, or what's the process of moving and changing it? It's sort of this perennial problem. And the now sort of has that, you've got space, but the now has that problem of either being absent or present. It can't transition, it can't change. So there's that, it's partly metaphysics of presence, I guess, in a way. It's the fundamental issue with it, thinking of existence and being in that kind of way.
Rachel, did you want to?
It was your last slide. What made me think about was when you're doing empirical research, what is fantastic is that you can go in any direction you want to analytically. Which, the time that I suppose for me, having done longitudinal studies, you can do that. You can read your data backwards. For example, you can start now and then start tracing somewhat backwards rather than doing it forwards. And also if you're doing intergenerational research where you're looking at accounts of generations over time, it's really, really interesting to read that data backwards rather than forwards. It gives a completely different emotional feeling. You can, so also you don't have to read it in a linear way at all either. You can juxtapose and start jumping around. So I think in some ways what you're describing here for empirical researchers really comes to life in the analytic process. We do have the freedom to be time travellers and to be really creative about some of these things in the analytic process in a way that actually, it sounds really sort of metaphysical when you present it as a philosophical kind of, and it feels like, isn't this beyond us? But actually in that very practical ways in the way we analyse, which is entirely feasible and interesting and enriching to play some of these games and ask how different does it look if you work backwards or if you start weaving backwards and forwards, which is also, as you're saying, it's an element of how we live and experience time as well.
Yeah, well I think that, it's that idea of significance, significance in Heidegger, that moments of time will have significance. So what I think is really interesting about this too is that we value the future so much more than we value the past, and we value children more than we value old people. And part of this is, so it's very concrete, repercussions that come of this very abstract question about how we oriented in time. And I think that's quite interesting. And I think philosophy, you can argue that philosophy has this orientation within time, because we're always looking back at Aristotle and Kant and, who cares about future philosophers? We don't care about them. It's always looking at what the past was and trying to trouble that past, I guess, as well. So
I just thought for your connection around political discourse, I think that the latest phrase, the Cameron phrase, we are where we are, which seems to just proliferate everywhere. All managers seem to. So, you know, it's just a really good example of using temporal, a sort of idea of temporal rupture to...
discontinuity.
Yeah, discontinuity in order to not have to do the work of continuity.
Yeah.
So it's a...
That's proper time, Richard. Proper time.
Okay, we've got Brian, and then do you want to...
Just a comment.
Okay.
Just following on from Rachel there, the work that I've really enjoyed is that notion of Kierkegaard's that we live our lives forward in time, we can actually understand our lives backwards in time. And yeah, there are certain social scientists that really picked up on that idea. And when they've gone back to data sets that have been gathered over time and done life history work, they've pieced together a tale backwards. You know, they've done that thing of saying, we could never have predicted the different trajectories of these lives and what would allow people to, you know, a sample to converge or diverge. But we can do it through hindsight. So that's just one more comment.
It's just a comment though, when you said we are, you know, future orientated, we are. I think it's very disciplinary. You know, there are disciplinary cultures around this. You chose philosophy, but I don't know any historians who don't do the past. It's more, you know, more important than the present future at all. I think that's one of the things that
in front
trouble.
of you as a historian.
Well, I don't know. I haven't thought that through. But maybe that's one of the things that trouble histories of discipline is they can't deal with some of these current political discourses about how to deal with current and future times.
Daniel, did you have anything else? Can I just... so you began by saying you weren't talking about Brexit and growth. Do you want to do 30 seconds on why you're not talking about Brexit and growth? Or...
Who said that?
I just said that Michelle started by saying that you weren't talking about Brexit, and Liz growth, and so I was just wondering if someone to say why she wasn't thinking about that rather than why you were talking about the others. I know you said it was idiosyncratic, that it was the people that you found useful, but I just wondered if you wanted to say.
Well, I mean, I think it is probably a bit, well, I guess they get talked, I think we talk about them a lot, in the sort of circles I've been in, they get talked about a lot, so I thought it was interesting. I mean, not that these people don't get talked about a lot, but I sort of wanted to have to do that, I guess, in a sense. But not, not for any particular reason,
Yeah, okay, it's not that you don't think they're useful or they're only useful. Okay, that's great, thanks very much. And